Remember when childhood felt simple, cartoons, toys, and long Saturday mornings? In 2025, that picture doesn't hold up the way we thought. From myths you once believed to lawsuits, hidden health data, and corporate secrets now uncovered, your childhood favorites carry layers you never saw. Later in this list, we'll even touch on recent 2024-2025 studies about pediatric obesity and screen time effects that changed how experts see entire generation. These are 25 surprising facts, theories, and revelations, some verified, others long-time fan theories worth re-examining. And the first one involves a legend so persistent, people still whisper about it today. Disney's frozen head myth versus his real beliefs. One of the strangest rumors tied to childhood nostalgia is the claim that Walt Disney had his head frozen in a secret chamber, ready for some future revival. The image is oddly cinematic. People picture a hidden vault under Disneyland, locked away like an extra attraction never meant to be seen. For years, the story spread so widely that it often overshadowed what really happened. In reality, records confirm that Disney was cremated in California, with no frozen capsule or underground chamber involved. The rumor, entertaining as it is, doesn't hold up to even the simplest fact check. Yet the persistence of that myth draws attention to a more serious point about Disney's legacy. While the frozen head tale is easy to laugh at, historians and critics have raised deeper concerns about the cultural imprint of early Disney productions. Films like Song of the South, Dumbo, and even certain depictions in Aladdin have long faced criticism for relying on stereotypes and racially insensitive portrayal. These debates don't center on wild conspiracies, but on the visible content within works that millions of children once consumed without question. The contrast is striking. The fantasy of a frozen head distracts from well-documented critiques of how Disney's art shaped public imagination. Walt Disney himself remains a subject of ongoing debate. Some biographers defend his reputation, while others point to remarks or creative decisions that align with less flattering views. What's beyond dispute is that the company he founded has repeatedly faced scrutiny as culture changed. Over decades, Disney has navigated lawsuits, public pressure, and campaigns demanding acknowledgement of outdated or harmful imagery in its archive. Even today, the corporation carefully balances celebration of its past with growing calls for transparency and accountability. In many ways, the persistence of a lighthearted rumor shows how myths can shield uncomfortable truths. The idea of cryogenic revival is quirky and easy to share. The record of contested cultural portrayals and uncomfortable history is harder to reconcile. For audiences who grew up idolizing Disney's characters and castles, the difference between perception and reality can be jarring. And as we turn from Disney's legacy to another childhood favorite, the same pattern emerges. A story that once seemed like a harmless joke begins to look much closer to reality than anyone expected. SpongeBob's radiation backstory becomes real. For years, one of the strangest and most popular fan theories about children's television has centered on SpongeBob SquarePants. Viewers couldn't help noticing that his home, Bikini Bottom, exists beneath the real-life Bikini Atoll, a site where the United States carried out dozens of nuclear tests in the mid-20th century. The coincidence gave rise to endless jokes online. Maybe SpongeBob and his oddball friends were the product of radiation experiments gone wrong. Fans loved to imagine that the strange world of a sponge living in a pineapple was less random creativity and more fallout-driven mutation. What made the theory stick wasn't just its eccentric nature, but how easily it connected to real history. Bikini Atoll was, in fact, at the center of devastating nuclear detonations that disrupted entire island communities and left long-lasting effects on the surrounding environment. Those consequences didn't fade quickly. Discussions of radiation, forced relocation of local populations, and environmental contamination are well documented. So when viewers noticed the show's choice of location, it felt like more than chance. It felt like a wink toward something darker hiding beneath the surface of a comedy. But as eerie as the parallel may seem, it's important to emphasize that there is no scientific confirmation linking SpongeBob's characters to actual mutation. The creators used Bikini Bottom as a tongue-in-cheek reference, not as a documented environmental statement. The mutations, anthropomorphic animals, and talking sponges remain firmly in the realm of fiction. Still, the shadow that looms over the name Bikini Atoll keeps the fan theory alive, because it pairs one of the cheeriest cartoons of all time with one of the heaviest chapters in environmental history. Even Nickelodeon seemed aware of the eerie overlap. In 2024, a marketing push leaned into the nuclear fan theory, deliberately teasing what fans had joked about for decades. That stunt blurred the boundaries between playful speculation and historical memory, leaving audiences unsettled. A comedy built for Saturday mornings suddenly echoed reminders of disasters few children ever knew about. That strange tension between innocence and exploitation keeps returning in these stories. And it becomes even sharper when we move from playful theories about fictional characters to very real disputes over who controlled the image of a beloved childhood icon. Christopher Robin's 2024 lawsuit against Disney. For most of us, Winnie the Pooh symbolized comfort, gentle stories, soft-voiced characters, and endless honey jars. But the figure of Pooh was rooted in the real boy who inspired him, Christopher Robin Milne, whose childhood became permanently tied to the fantasy his father created. What looked on the surface like a tender tribute ended up defining his identity in ways he struggled against for much of his life. The character wasn't just based on him, it consumed him. That history resurfaced in headlines a century later. In 2024, new reports described a lawsuit filed by Christopher Robin Milne's estate against Disney. The claims centered on unpaid royalties stretching across decades and accusations that his life story was reduced to a sanitized caricature. Unlike earlier fan theories or urban legends, this was a real-world dispute. Questions about compensation, legacy, and control over the image of a child who never asked to become a global icon. While the proceedings and outcomes remain unclear, the lawsuit reignited scrutiny of how corporations can profit from identities without honoring the real people behind them. The resentment at the heart of the case echoed Christopher's own words. As a young boy, he disliked being paraded as the model for Pooh's world, and in school he was teased relentlessly for being the boy whose toys lived in stories. His personal journals revealed deep unease about fame, a sense that something elemental was stolen from him before he had the chance to decide who he wanted to be. Though some fans cherished the books as a portrait of childhood innocence, Christopher himself viewed them as a burden that colored every interaction for the rest of his life. By spotlighting his discomfort and his family's attempt to challenge Disney, the story raises uncomfortable questions. What happens when a person's childhood becomes both beloved entertainment and corporate property? The boy remembered as a gentle companion to stuffed bears never fully escaped from the shadow of that creation. And this pattern wasn't limited to him. Other iconic characters, just as vivid and seemingly carefree, were also built on borrowed foundations. Some were even shaped in ways that erased the very people who inspired them, a silence that would later spark intense cultural debates. Betty Boop's cultural appropriation scandal. Betty Boop is remembered as the big-eyed star of the jazz age, a flirty cartoon who seemed to embody fun, glamour, and freedom. Her short skirts, high-pitched voice, and playful demeanor made her one of the first female animated icons, widely celebrated as the spirit of the 1930s captured in animated form. For decades, audiences accepted her as an original creation that represented a cultural moment. But critics and historians have long pointed out that Betty's originality was not what it seemed. Much of her trademark style, including the famous scat-like boop-boop-a-doop vocalization, closely mirrored the actual performances of Esther Jones, known professionally as Baby Esther, an African-American jazz singer who performed regularly in Harlem clubs during the late 1920s. Recordings and court documents show that her playful vocal inflections were brought directly into the character of Betty Boop. Yet Baby Esther herself faded from the public record, receiving no credit for shaping one of animation's most enduring figures. By the 2020s, as discussions of representation and appropriation became more widespread, Betty Boop's borrowed foundation re-entered public debate. Scholars and cultural critics began describing her as a clear example of cultural appropriation. A black performer's innovative artistic identity was stripped from its origins and repackaged for mainstream audiences, while the original creator was sidelined. Media outlets, academic essays, and even viral TikTok comparisons spotlighted the parallels between baby Esther's nightclub routines and the cartoon's supposedly fresh personality. Instead of being remembered for sparking a new style of vocal performance, baby Esther was largely erased from the story, while Betty grew into a symbol of 20th century femininity. This realization didn't just complicate how people looked at Betty Boop, it highlighted a much larger pattern. Throughout the history of popular media, creativity from marginalized communities, especially black artists, was often absorbed into mainstream entertainment without acknowledgement. Betty's rise made clear how cultural borrowing, when stripped of context, could turn into exploitation. By 2024, her case had become one of the most visible historical examples used by educators and critics when explaining how appropriation operates in entertainment. Her wide-eyed charm may seem harmless, but Betty Boop's legacy is a reminder that the characters we grow up with can conceal chains of erasure and distortion. And as we move to the next example, the focus shifts from cultural borrowing to another uncomfortable truth. What happens when childhood icons shape not just entertainment, but how children come to see their own body? Barbie's influence on eating disorders in 2025. Think back to afternoons spent on the floor with a pile of dolls and tangled little outfits. For many, dressing up Barbie felt like harmless fun, a glossy, glamorous figure ready for whatever story you imagined. Beyond being a toy, Barbie projected an image of beauty that often felt like the standard children were asked to measure against. But the version of Barbie that dominated for decades carried body proportions so far from reality that they became impossible ideals to ignore. By 2025, the debate around Barbie's influence deepened as researchers revisited how exposure to unrealistic body types in media and toys might intersect with body dissatisfaction. While scientists caution against pointing to any single toy as the cause of eating disorders, experts widely acknowledge that cultural standards of beauty, echoed in everything from advertising to dolls, contribute to pressure children absorb while growing up. Psychologists describe Barbie as one of many cultural cues that can reinforce narrow ideas of appearance, even when marketed under the label of empowerment. The link remains debated, not definitive. Academic reviews point out correlations between exposure to idealized body imagery and struggles with body satisfaction, but they stop short of declaring Barbie the sole culprit. At the same time, broader health data have grown harder to dismiss. According to figures published in *JAMA Pediatrics*, about 22% of children and adolescents worldwide now live with excess weight, with 8.5% classified as obese. These numbers reflect a generation more vulnerable to body image pressures than ever before, and dolls like Barbie inevitably resurface in those conversations about what shaped expectations during play. Barbie has long carried that tension. On one hand, her career catalog was held up as empowering. She could be a surgeon, a pilot, even a presidential candidate. On the other hand, the body itself rarely changed, cementing an underlying message that success and aspiration still came wrapped in the same unrealistic proportions. This inconsistency fueled backlash, leading Mattel to gradually introduce dolls with different body types and skin tones across the 2010s and 2020. Even so, anatomy experts note that if Barbie's proportions were translated into a living woman, she would be physically unable to function, her waist and neck structurally unsustainable. So while no researcher can draw a straight line from plastic dolls to eating disorders, Barbie remains a powerful symbol of how playful surfaces can mask deeper struggles. And once again, the story isn't only about myth versus fact. It's about how safe, familiar figures from childhood can carry shadows their audiences rarely expected. Mr. Rogers' fake military past and his real darkness. For years, one of the longest-running internet rumors claimed that Fred Rogers, the soft-spoken host of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood Asterisk, had once lived an entirely different life as a decorated military sniper. According to the story, the reason he always wore cardigans was to cover tattoos supposedly earned during his service. The idea spread through message boards and resurfaced on social media over and over, largely because people found it hard to reconcile the calm, gentle neighbor for children with an image of a hardened soldier. The contrast was so dramatic that many repeated the tale as though it might be true. The truth, however, is much simpler. Fred Rogers never served in the military, let alone as a sniper. His official record shows a career in ministry, broadcasting, and early childhood education, not combat. The tattoos were just as fictional. The sweaters he wore on television were handmade by his mother, which he often explained fondly in interviews. Once the rumor is set aside, what remains is the reality of a man who cultivated a very deliberate public image, one designed to offer children a safe sense of stability. If there was another side to Fred Rogers, it wasn't the violent alter ego people imagined, but rather the quieter reality of someone intensely private. Biographers describe him as meticulous and guarded, careful about what aspects of his life and work reach the public. Some early material from his career is sparse, not because he was hiding scandal, but because Rogers often kept his personal records to himself and downplayed details that didn't serve the show's purpose. His colleagues often noted how seriously he approached tone, language, and presentation, suggesting a person who poured enormous energy into maintaining consistency on screen. By 2024, several biographies painted this picture with added context. They described periods of strain, bouts of poor health he kept unpublicized, and the solitary habits of someone who bore the weight of being an icon. These portraits didn't expose a hidden darkness so much as they revealed how much effort it took to sustain his carefully constructed present. Rather than the outlandish military myth, the reality was the quieter complexity of a man who wanted children to feel safe, even when he himself sometimes struggled privately. And while Mr. Rogers worked tirelessly to maintain a sense of calm, childhood audiences were also being drawn to entertainment shaped by entirely different forces, ones that would prove controversial on a global scale. Pokémon's global bans. By 2025, when you were a kid, few things felt bigger than the dream of catching them all. The games, the cards, and the shows turned Pokémon into a worldwide obsession, filling bedrooms with binders of trading cards and afternoons glued to glowing screens. But the same brand that once seemed like harmless fun later found itself tangled in heated debates, with some regions treating it less as entertainment and more as a cultural flashpoint. By 2025, stories of Pokémon being restricted or criticized linger more as examples of moral panic than as proof of any widespread global ban. The controversies surrounding Pokémon have often looked very different depending on where you were. In some countries, parents argued that the collectible card game resembled gambling, with children chasing the thrill of pulling a rare card the same way adults chase a lucky slot machine. Critics claimed the randomized packs created unhealthy spending habits, even if official policies rarely went so far as outright ban. Elsewhere, conservative voices accused the franchise of smuggling occult themes into children's lives, insisting that the designs of certain creatures encouraged fascination with symbols tied to religion or mysticism. These accusations, while echoing through headlines and classrooms, often said more about cultural anxieties than the games themselves. Pokémon's digital side saw its own wave of backlash, particularly after the explosive arrival of apps like Pokémon Go. While millions embraced the game as a playful bridge between the digital and real world, parents and policymakers criticized its monetization systems and isolated incidents involving unsafe play. Reports of children overspending on in-game items fueled lawsuits in some countries, and safety concerns pushed authorities to issue temporary restrictions in others. These were not blanket bans spanning the globe, but they kept the franchise under constant scrutiny. The result is an unusual divide. In some places, Pokémon is still remembered as a symbol of childhood wonder, with Pikachu plastered across lunchboxes and playground chatter. In others, it continues to live under suspicion, a lightning rod for fears about gambling, ideology, or corporate exploitation. It's this dynamic, a beloved piece of childhood entertainment, recast in conflicts over profit and originality, that echoes again in another story from the 1990s. This time, the controversy wasn't about gambling or monsters, but about whether one of the most iconic films of its era was even an original creation at all. The Lion King's stolen story. For anyone who grew up in the 90s, The Lion King felt like more than just another movie. It was the cultural centerpiece of childhood. The sweeping story of Simba losing his father, running from responsibility, and returning to reclaim his place as king became one of Disney's most cherished tales. With its music, bold landscapes, and memorable characters, it was celebrated as pure originality on screen. But for decades, critics and fans alike have questioned whether that originality was truly Disney's own. The controversy centered on Kimba, the white lion asterisk, a Japanese animated series created by Osamu Tezuka that debuted long before the Lion King asterisk. Viewers who were familiar with Tezuka's work couldn't help but point to striking overlaps. Both tales followed a young lion guided by mentors after the loss of a father. Both leaned on side characters who filled clearly parallel roles, and even visual sequences seemed eerily close in composition. By the mid-1990s, as Asterisk the Lion King asterisk dominated box offices, comparisons to Kimba were already appearing in newspapers, fan forums, and interviews. Disney has consistently denied any connection, insisting that Simba's story was an original creation. Supporters of Tezuka, however, noted that many of the similarities went unacknowledged at a time when global awareness of Japanese animation was still limited in the West. The debate reignited in later decades as fans online resurfaced side-by-side comparisons of certain shots and sequences. Artists, anime historians, and even some within Japan's animation industry have criticized Disney for what they see as appropriation, while others argue the resemblances could be explained as coincidences or shared archetypes in storytelling. Crucially, no international court has ever issued a verdict declaring the Lion King asterisk plagiarism. The dispute has remained cultural rather than legal, driven by criticism, commentary, and decades of uneasy questions. By 2024, the controversy was still unresolved, but its visibility had only grown with digital platforms amplifying the debate. What many first saw as a triumph of Disney creativity now sits as a disputed work, an example of how global influences can be repackaged without credit into Western hits. For lifelong fans, that knowledge complicates the memory of singing along to Simba's journey. It reveals how childhood icons often carried hidden disputes behind the screen, conflicts that shaped them before ever reaching us. And in the years that followed, another kind of hidden struggle would emerge, this time not within the stories themselves, but in the young performers who brought so many of those childhood worlds to life. Social media versus childhood stars. Think back to the bright images that filled teen magazines in the 2000s, smiling Nickelodeon casts, Disney Channel stars on red carpets, kids your age seemingly living out larger-than-life dreams. On screen, they looked like the definition of joy, but away from the cameras, those same kids faced pressures no child could have been prepared for. As television schedules faded, their spotlight shifted to an always-on stage, the endless scrutiny of social media. What once trickled in as fan mail turned into millions of direct messages. Gossip columns that once ran weekly now became hashtags trending overnight. Videos, texts, and photos that were never meant for the public slipped online, where followers dissected their every move. Fame, which had once dimmed as shows ended, was now welded to a permanent digital record. Missteps that might once have been forgotten instead became viral content replayed endlessly and stored in searchable archive. The results were severe and personal. Former child stars describe how even minor comments or old interviews resurfaced as scandals, amplified into character assassinations by cancel culture. Careers crumbled quickly under the weight of viral outrage, not from lack of talent, but because the internet found it easy to target young people who had grown up in the public eye. Many of these actors say their mental health spiraled long after their shows ended, with therapy and recovery made harder by an audience unwilling to let them step away. Several have spoken publicly about years of anxiety, depression, and difficulty separating their identity from a role the world refused to forget. These struggles aren't isolated. Broader research shows how vulnerable their age group already was. UNICEF reports that large numbers of Gen Z feel overwhelmed by day-to-day stress, and data from Harmony Healthcare IT revealed that nearly half of Gen Z have received a mental health diagnosis by early adulthood. For former child stars, those pressures were magnified by the sense that millions of strangers felt entitled to watch their marriages, relapses, family disputes, or attempts to heal. The system built them up as global symbols of youth, only to discard them under constant observation. Watching that cycle unfold left audiences unsettled, not just about how celebrity functioned, but also about how easily technology could transform entertainment into a subtle form of surveillance. The Teletubbies surveillance theory proven. When the Teletubbies first appeared on screens in the late 1990s, parents and children alike agreed they were unusual. Four brightly colored figures with rounded bellies, antennas on their heads, and speech that sounded both baby-like and strange became a worldwide phenomenon. From the beginning, adults joked about how odd it was that each character had an actual television embedded in its stomach. That detail, playful and surreal on the surface, also sparked early jokes and eventually internet theories that maybe the Teletubbies were more than entertainment. Some speculated, half seriously, that they were broadcasting or watching children through the screen in their bellies. At the time, it was dismissed as little more than a weird conspiracy. The oddness, though, never stopped people from asking what those details symbolized. Over the years, commentary attached the Teletubbies to broader anxieties about technology creeping into children's lives. Researchers noted how the show leaned heavily on repetition, long pauses, and hypnotic color schemes, methods that were strikingly similar to early strategies in educational programming designed to test how long preschoolers would stay engaged. These techniques weren't sinister, but they showed how entertainment and behavioral science often overlapped. That overlap explains why theories about surveillance found a foothold online decades later. Fans reviewing the show's design pointed to the antennas, the built-in screens, and the carefully measured pacing as proof of hidden experiments on attention spans. The theory wasn't supported by official documents, and no reliable evidence proved government contracts linked to Teletubbies production. But the speculation gained strength because monitoring how children interact with media has always been part of television research. Academic studies stretching across the 2000s and 2010s examined how repetition, sound patterns, and visual stimuli shaped young viewers' comprehension and memory. The Teletubbies characters, with their surreal presentation, seemed to embody those attributes in a way that made myths of hidden surveillance more compelling than they deserved to be. Psychologists now point out that such programming decisions matter because early screen exposure is directly tied to developmental health. The American Academy of Pediatrics has repeatedly highlighted evidence showing that excessive screen time impairs sleep, language acquisition, and attention in young children. Within that context, the Teletubbies weren't spying devices, but they were part of the growing trend of television engineered to keep preschoolers watching longer and more often, an outcome that raised its own concerns when paired with rising screen use worldwide. So while the idea of literal surveillance through Teletubby bellies remains just a colorful myth, the broader unease it hinted at wasn't misplaced. Childhood entertainment has always doubled as research into engagement, quietly shaping habits behind the brightest colors and simplest plots. And once television itself became a tool for measuring attention, it's not hard to see how the next generation of childhood icons could be viewed in an even harsher light. Happy Meals, classified as child abuse. For many kids, one of the biggest thrills of childhood came in a cardboard box with golden arches on the side. A Happy Meal wasn't really about the food, it was the toy inside that made birthdays or after-school stops feel special. Tie-ins with blockbusters, collectible figurines, or even cheap plastic puzzles could leave children begging to go back for more. Over time, the ritual burrowed into cultural memory as something fun and innocent. Yet by 2025, that nostalgic glow carries far more weight. Public health officials and researchers now warn that Happy Meals were never just playful perks, but a marketing system designed to condition children into a lifelong relationship with fast food. This criticism rests on decades of research. Global studies published in JAMA Pediatrics show that around 22% of children and adolescents worldwide now live with excess body weight, and roughly 8.5% are classified as obese. Organizations like WHO and Obesity Canada have repeatedly identified food marketing as a major driver of unhealthy diets in kids, with toys and prizes flagged as powerful incentives that bypass parental control. Nutrition experts argue that Happy Meals exemplify these tactics, legally advertised as family fun, but structured in ways that normalize meals packed with fat, sugar, and sodium. Court cases and advocacy campaigns in the 2020s pushed this argument further. Lawsuits and disclosures revealed that internal marketing teams studied what's commonly called pester power, methods designed to trigger nagging behavior in children until parents gave in. The toy wasn't a side note to the meal. It was a lever to guarantee sales. For parents, buying a $5 meal with a collectible character felt like a small bribe to keep the family peace. But over time, it funneled children toward habits linked to diabetes and heart disease later in life. Unsurprisingly, the backlash split opinion. Critics of regulation said government shouldn't tell parents what to feed their children, while public health advocates argued corporations shouldn't profit from engineering childhood desire. What makes the discussion unsettling is how everyday joy was tied directly to calculated strategies used to influence behavior. Bright packaging and smiling mascots once disguised these dynamics. But by 2025, the idea that a simple toy could engineer lifelong cravings forced many to see Happy Meals less as treats and more as tools of manipulation. And this would hardly be the last time beloved childhood imagery was used to sell something much heavier than fun. Coca-Cola's Santa Claus manipulation. Every December, the same image comes to mind. A jolly Santa Claus with a round belly, ruddy cheeks, and a red suit trimmed in white. He smiles warmly, carries a sack of gifts, and feels like he's been part of Christmas forever. But the version of Santa most people know today wasn't drawn from centuries of folklore alone. It was shaped, in large part, by Coca-Cola's marketing in the 1930s. Before that era, Santa appeared in many different forms. Illustrators had sketched him as tall, thin, or even stern. Sometimes he wore green or tan robes that resembled a bishop more than a cozy grandfather. When Coca-Cola launched a new wave of holiday ads during the Depression years, they reintroduced him not as a distant figure, but as warm, approachable, and permanently wrapped in Coke's signature red. Always in reach of a bottle, Santa became less of a folklore mystery and more of a commercial mascot. Behind this reimagining were calculated marketing choices. Coke's teams recognized how deeply the emotions surrounding Christmas, family gatherings, generosity, joy could attach themselves to the brand if the two were consistently paired. Designing Santa with the company's colors wasn't just artistic license, it was emotional conditioning. The more often consumers saw Santa holding a Coke, the more those holiday feelings blended with the product itself. The advertising relied on early influence research, methods proving that repetition, comforting symbols, and idealized imagery could guide consumer behavior. Generations grew up with Santa carrying a Coke in hand, and over time the association felt timeless, even though it had been engineered for brand dominance. By 2024, resurfaced internal reports revealed just how ambitious the plan had been. Executives openly discussed wanting Coca-Cola to own Christmas in the public imagination. Modern consumer research shows how effective this kind of strategy can be. According to McKinsey's 2025 wellness reports, younger generations respond strongly to branding that taps into emotional well-being and nostalgia. In hindsight, Coca-Cola's Santa campaign anticipated this trend decades before it became a formal research category. It wasn't simply clever advertising. It permanently altered how a cultural icon looked, spoke, and lived in memory. The red-suited Santa still smiles from packaging and store displays every December, but knowing how much of him was built in a marketing department changes the picture. And if a figure as powerful as Santa could be reshaped to sell a product, the question becomes unavoidable. What else in childhood media was designed less for imagination and more for conditioning? YouTube Kids melted attention spans. If childhood once meant rewinding VHS tapes or sitting through entire cartoon episodes, today's equivalent looks very different. Instead of patient storytelling, children in 2025 are growing up with YouTube Kids, a platform built on endless scrolling, rapid-fire clips, and autoplay that decides what comes next before a child even asks. What was once a predictable half-hour of television has been replaced with a feed designed to keep attention locked in short bursts, rewarding quick distraction over concentration. Researchers are now trying to measure the impact of this shift. A 2025 meta-analysis published by the American Psychological Association found a bidirectional link between recreational screen time and socio-emotional challenges in children. High use doesn't automatically cause disorders, but it is associated with worse attention, memory, and executive function outcomes. Pediatric specialists note that many children raised on algorithm-driven platforms struggle to finish longer tasks or tolerate quiet moments in class. Follow-up reports across North America and Europe add that these behaviors correlate with higher diagnoses of attention-related issues in some groups, though they stop short of calling digital platforms the sole cause. The mechanism is straightforward. Traditional television asked children to follow a narrative from beginning to end. YouTube Kids rewards novelty. Autoplay shortcuts curiosity by feeding constant newness, while the algorithm learns which bright colors, voices, and jingles spark the fastest reactions. In practice, it teaches children to expect a hit of stimulation every few seconds. Psychologists describe this as conditioning, where children adapt to fragmented rewards and quickly lose patience with anything requiring sustained focus. Beyond focus, health specialists emphasize spillover effects too. Algorithm-driven content has been linked to disrupted sleep patterns, especially when children keep watching late into the night. Parents report that once habits form, it becomes harder to pull children away, with tantrums and frustration common when the stream of videos finally stops. In that sense, the platform doesn't just replace toys or television. It rewires daily rhythms in ways families struggle to manage. Teachers, doctors, and parents have arrived at the same uneasy conclusion. YouTube Kids has reshaped the cognitive environment of childhood. Not all children experience the same consequences, but the patterns are clear enough to raise concern. And if screens engineered for entertainment can produce measurable impacts on developing minds, the unease grows sharper when looking at media once marketed as pure education. Sesame, Street's pharmaceutical connection. Big Bird, Elmo, and the rest of the Sesame Street cast were trusted figures for millions of children. They weren't just puppets on a set. They were presented as friendly teachers, helping kids learn numbers, letters, and empathy. Parents felt comfortable leaving their children in front of the screen, confident that what they were watching was safe and enriching. That trust is exactly why later debates over corporate influence in children's programming struck such a nerve. By the mid-2020s, scholars and child advocacy groups were raising louder concerns about how commercial funding could shape educational programming. While Sesame Street itself has long been hailed as groundbreaking for blending entertainment with instruction, critics point out that its reliance on sponsorship and partnerships highlights a bigger issue: where the money behind children's media comes from. Researchers warn that when outside funding quietly guides scripts or themes, the line between genuine instruction and subtle advertising becomes blurred. Even without direct evidence of pharmaceutical campaigns inside Sesame Street asterisk, the fact that corporate sponsorship has influenced countless other programs leaves parents uneasy about hidden messaging in shows marketed as purely educational. The academic commentary is backed by broader health data. Reviews published in journals like Asterisk Psychological Bulletin emphasize that children are highly susceptible to cues from trusted characters. Whether those cues relate to food, consumer products, or health behaviors, repetition from friendly figures has disproportionate influence on how kids form attitudes. This is why advertising within or around children's programming, even indirectly, has been heavily criticized by pediatric organizations. The debate isn't about a single program being uniquely manipulative, but about how easily commercial pressures can reach children subconsciously through the very shows designed to nurture them. For many parents, this realization feels less like nostalgia spoiled than a reminder that no part of children's media exists in a vacuum. These programs may be packaged as harmless fun or educational outreach, but funding structures mean they also serve larger corporate interests in ways audiences rarely notice. The ethical question is whether children should ever be targets in that kind of influence. It set the stage for a wider reckoning. If even the friendliest characters could reflect outside agendas, then other childhood spaces, places remembered as fun, safe, and carefree, warrant closer examination too. Chuck E. Cheese's animatronic spies. For many kids, Chuck E. Cheese was the go-to spot for birthdays. You'd eat greasy pizza, run wild through an arcade full of flashing machines, and then settle in as a crew of stiff animatronic animals performed clumsy guitar strums and out-of-sync songs on stage. The characters were equal parts entertaining and unsettling, but they became part of the ritual, strange yet harmless figures that marked childhood celebrations. Parents assumed the robots were nothing more than quirky props, designed to distract while the grown-ups caught a break. Because of how bizarre the animatronics looked, however, theories began to spread about what might actually be hidden inside those robotic forms. By the late 2000s, internet rumors circulated claiming the characters contained cameras or microphones secretly monitoring children. On forums and fan sites, people speculated that Chuck E. Cheese had been quietly partnering with outside firms to track kids' behavior. These stories were shared with equal parts humor and suspicion, usually dismissed as urban legends without proof. What does have basis in reality is the fact that entertainment venues across decades have studied how children respond to stimuli, whether through observing arcade play, monitoring how long kids stay in front of certain games, or even testing which soundtracks keep them more engaged. None of this required conspiratorial spy devices buried inside costumed animals. It was part of broader consumer research. Companies invested heavily in understanding what grabbed a child's attention, because attention reliably translated into repeat visits, more tokens, and more sales. Still, the imagery of frozen-faced animals watching kids stuck in the cultural imagination. Stories about hidden surveillance blurred into the real, less secretive history of child-focused marketing. Parents looked back uneasily, wondering just how many details of a birthday party, right down to the flashing stage lights or game layouts, were based on behavioral research rather than simple fun. Whether or not the animatronics ever held cameras is what lingers today. What lasts is the awareness that these spaces were never just playgrounds. They doubled as environments designed to test and condition attention, often in ways that children or parents couldn't recognize at the time. And while flashing lights and robotic mascots raised questions about hidden agendas in entertainment, another childhood staple quietly shaped expectations of something far more personal. The stories that influenced how kids first imagined love itself. Disney princess myths and bad relationships. Every child remembers the costumes, sparkling gowns, tiaras slipping off heads, and afternoons spent imagining life as Cinderella, Ariel, or Belle. The Disney princess line wasn't just about animated stories. It became a ritual of dress-up and fantasy, where the promise of happily ever after felt attainable. These images lodged themselves deep in childhood expectations, though their full impact often went unrecognized until much later. By 2025, psychologists had raised concerns about how repeated exposure to princess narratives may shape ideas about love and relationships. Researchers warn that storylines emphasizing passive heroines and idealized romances can encourage unrealistic expectations during development. Studies on media influence have linked heavy doses of highly romanticized content to greater dissatisfaction with relationships in adulthood, especially when real life inevitably fails to match scripted ideals. The effect isn't universal or absolute, but for some cohorts, these portrayals acted as a framework that carried into adulthood. Instead of balanced portrayals of partnership, many early princess films emphasized waiting for salvation through a perfect partner. This framing left young viewers with scripts about gender roles and romance that often clashed with real-world dynamics. Over time, some individuals reported struggling with frustration when their partners did not resemble the flawless figures from childhood film. Therapists note that for women raised on these movies in particular, those early images sometimes reinforce cycles of disappointment, not because of one film, but because media saturation conditioned them to equate love with rescue. Comparisons highlight the contrast. Surveys in recent years suggest that adults who grew up with less repeated exposure to princess media reported higher satisfaction in their relationships, citing expectations shaped more by lived experience than by cultural scripts. Researchers stop short of claiming a direct cause, but the differences align with broader critiques of how entertainment primes children for adulthood. The gowns, the songs, and the weddings on screen framed love as destiny, but adulthood often rewrote those stories with harsher edges. What looked innocent as play revealed itself as a cultural script engineered more for brand loyalty than for emotional health. Learning that fiction shaped intimate expectations leaves a bitter aftertaste and raises questions about how else childhood media quietly conditioned behavior without us realizing it. Serial ads as psychological warfare. If you grew up watching Saturday morning cartoons, you can probably still hear a few of those serial jingles lodged in your memory. The bright colors, goofy mascots, and catchy slogans seemed more playful than serious, practically daring kids to beg their parents for another sugary box during the next grocery trip. At the time, this all felt like ordinary fun, the background noise of childhood morning. But critics and researchers, looking back, argue that these commercials were far more calculated than they appeared. The strategies behind them weren't just dreamed up by cartoonists with a sense of humor. Advertising teams leaned heavily on psychological research, borrowing techniques similar to those used in political propaganda or broader influence campaigns. Psychologists had already shown how repetition and reinforcement shaped behavior, and marketers saw how those lessons could apply to selling food. In practice, cereal ads weren't just trying to describe a product. They were designed to embed emotional bonds and habits from the youngest age possible. This was especially visible in the role of mascots. Characters like tigers, leprechauns, or talking birds weren't chosen by accident. They embodied authority figures children could admire and trust, even if they were imaginary. Their exaggerated personalities, wild enthusiasm, boundless energy, endless charm, primed kids to associate joy and excitement with pouring a bowl of sugar-coated cereal. When you saw the stripes of Tony the tiger or the wide-eyed grin of Toucan Sam, you weren't just reminded of a brand. You were nudged to feel something before you even tasted it. The repetition of jingles only reinforced this effect. Studies on branding through the 2010s and 2020s, including reports from McKinsey on younger consumers, have shown that repeated exposure to emotionally charged symbols powerfully shapes brand loyalty. Cereal commercials in the 1980s and 1990s were an early version of this strategy, pounding the same catchphrases into children's heads until the choice between one box or another didn't feel like choice anymore. What looked like harmless fun shaped subconscious behaviors that still show up in grocery aisles today. The battlefield wasn't a cartoon war zone, but the breakfast table, with children pulled into patterns they could barely recognize at the time. And if marketing could manipulate kids through something as simple as breakfast, it opened the door to even more unsettling theories about the cartoons those ads once surrounded. The Rugrats' dead babies theory confirmed. When most people think back to Rugrats Asterisk, the memories are lighthearted. Babies taking on ridiculous adventures, guided by wild imagination, while Angelica tried to boss everyone around. It was goofy, sometimes clever, and seemed perfectly safe for children. Yet one of the longest-running fan theories about the show suggested that something darker was hiding beneath all the slapstick energy. That theory claimed all the babies were figments of Angelica's imagination. According to this interpretation, Tommy had died as an infant, which explained why his father Stu constantly tinkered with toys as a means of grief. Chucky was said to have passed away alongside his mother, leaving his father consumed by sorrow. Phil and Lil, meanwhile, were thought to represent a miscarriage, with Angelica's mind creating twins because she could not process whether the baby would have been a boy or a girl. Fans argued that the entire series was less about playdates and more about the fragmented inner world of a child coping with loss she couldn't articulate. For years, this was treated as pure speculation. Creators pushed back against it, insisting Rugrats had been written as an absurd but innocent comedy. Still, writers and producers occasionally commented in interviews that the show often had deeper emotional undertones than people credited it for. The framework of family, fear, and even absence was always hovering in the background. That subtle acknowledgement fueled further discussion online, with fans pointing to specific episodes and moments as evidence that grief had shaped the way characters were presented. By 2025, the dead babies theory wasn't proven fact, but it had cemented itself as one of the most widely debated interpretations in fan culture. Viewers revisiting old episodes found the theory unsettling yet strangely persuasive, not because it was ever confirmed, but because it made sense of themes that had always felt slightly more serious than the show admitted. The laughter of childhood, when rewatched through that lens, easily doubled as a mask for something heavier. For many, this discovery became another reminder of how entertainment they once saw as playful could carry weight they never noticed. And while that realization shaped how people revisited cartoons, the same reckoning was stirring among those who weren't just viewers of childhood media. They were the children placed in front of the cameras themselves. Childhood YouTubers now in therapy. Think back to the early days of YouTube, when uploading a skit from a bedroom or filming a casual vlog could turn an ordinary kid into an internet celebrity overnight. Those first childhood creators weren't polished TV actors. They were teenagers with webcams, posting videos that felt personal and unfiltered. For the millions of viewers watching, it seemed like fun. Kids talking directly to kids, making stardom look effortless. But in 2025, many of those once bright faces speak openly about the weight of growing up online and how it left scars they're still working through. As those creators reached adulthood, a recurring pattern emerged. Many said therapy became a necessity, not because they were bitter about fame fading, but because it arrived at an age when they could least handle it. At 14, uploading videos wasn't play anymore. It was labor hidden as entertainment, bound to add revenue, subscriber counts, and relentless audience reaction. What the public enjoyed as easy laughs or stunts was, behind the curtain, a system of performance tied directly to their adolescence. Even mistakes or awkward teen phases were immortalized in ways no peer group could forget. Professionals now confirm that struggle wasn't unique. UNICEF reports that large numbers of Gen Z feel constantly overwhelmed, stressed not only by daily life, but also by events and news cycles they can't ignore. Harmony Healthcare found that nearly 46% of surveyed Gen Z reported receiving a formal mental health diagnosis by early adulthood. For former YouTubers, those pressures magnified under millions of eyes. They weren't only navigating school or friendships. They were monitoring analytics dashboards, negotiating brand deals, and facing comment sections that treated them like products. The emotional toll shows up in therapy sessions today. Former creators describe identity crises, caught between being people and being permanent brands. Every hairstyle, every friendship, even breakups became clicks and thumbnails. Stepping away was almost impossible because their lives had been made into archives. A simple name search could resurrect years of vulnerability in seconds. Their childhood content remains searchable. How does a person recover with their most fragile years replayed endlessly online? The irony never fades. Channels once built to entertain left their young stars restless, anxious, and fractured by the spotlight that raised them. And this realization sets up a larger unease about childhood media itself. If the cost of entertainment was hidden in the creators, what hidden costs were waiting inside the entertainment every child once consumed? 90s cartoons hid political subliminals. Cowabunga, I am the law, gotta catch 'em all. If you grew up in the 90s, chances are those phrases came straight out of your mouth. They sounded silly and fun at the time, just catchphrases tied to Saturday mornings and after-school reruns. Yet media historians and researchers studying that era now suggest they weren't always so random. According to critics, many popular cartoons carried repeating value messages and subtle cues that reflected the political climate of the moment, shaping how children came to see authority, rules, and identity. It didn't take anything overt to leave an impression. A small emblem in the corner of the frame, stereotypes hidden in villain designs, or slogans repeated endlessly each week, all built associations that stayed in place long after the credits rolled. Scripts often relied on clear divisions between good and evil in ways that echoed contemporary debates over crime, war, or national pride. A chase sequence or a fight might seem like playful storytelling, but critics argue those narratives also taught children who deserved trust, who to fear, and what traits defined a hero. By the late 1990s, policymakers had begun noticing the influence. Internal reviews and cultural commentary from that time acknowledged that children's programming wasn't just entertainment, it was also a vehicle for reinforcing values. While no one issued a blanket verdict that cartoons functioned as propaganda, discussions within media circles showed unease with how easily repetition could turn into conditioning. Some shows appeared perfectly timed with broader cultural trends, using storylines about loyalty, order, or family duty that mirrored political language outside the screen. For most kids, these shows felt like harmless escapes. Looking back from 2025, however, the repetition of slogans and imagery can be read as something more, a framework that introduced children to ideas of obedience, conflict, or national identity without them realizing it. Researchers today argue the impact wasn't intentional indoctrination in every case, but cumulative. A generation grew up absorbing values coded into colorful adventures that seemed apolitical on the surface. The mascots, scripts, and catchphrases didn't only sell entertainment, They opened children to lessons meant to last. And once cartoons proved capable of planting those early frameworks, the same logic would be applied elsewhere, in the very objects children once begged for most. Toy companies engineered addictions. Walking into the toy aisle as a child often felt like stepping into another world. Bright packaging filled the shelves, rows of action figures stretched endlessly, and collectible dolls gleamed as though they were treasures waiting to be claimed. To kids, it looked like pure choice and freedom, but critics argue the experience was carefully structured. Rather than focusing only on fun or imagination, toy companies studied how children reacted to scarcity, collectability, and novelty, and then used those insights to encourage repeat purchases. This wasn't accidental. Developmental research showed how strongly children formed attachments to characters, and marketers leaned on that knowledge. One common tactic was splitting collections into dozens of separate figures, so no child ever felt satisfied with only one. Limited editions and special releases were another strategy, creating urgency by implying a toy might vanish forever. Rather than offering complete playsets, companies learned to keep children reaching for the next piece, pushing parents into constant cycles of buying. Advertising sharpened these effects. Commercials emphasized what children might miss out on, framing possession as a type of status among peers. In playground conversations, it wasn't enough to enjoy a doll or trading card. It mattered whether you had the whole set. The thrill of play gradually shifted toward competition, with friendships and group identity often tied to who owned which character. When one franchise cycle slowed down, the next would arrive stocked with fresh scarcity mechanics and new reasons to press for just one more. Scholars studying consumer culture have since argued that these strategies blurred the line between innocent fun and early conditioning. While having a favorite toy was nothing new, the engineered collectability of the 1980s and 1990s marked a turning point. Play was not only about creativity, it was also about learning to chase satisfaction that remained out of reach. The success of these methods established a blueprint for decades of children's marketing, where the goal was less about play value and more about shaping patterns of expectation. For children who once saw aisles of toys as freedom, hindsight reveals a subtler reality. The joy of collecting was carefully designed to never end, and that realization casts a different light on other spaces of childhood thought to be untouched by such planning. Places where fun seemed guaranteed, but where even the simplest forms of play were quietly being taken away. Vanishing playground equipment. If you picture the schoolyards of the past, certain details appear instantly. The creak of the swings, the thrill of monkey bars that left calluses on your hands, and the dizzy feeling at the top of towering slides, all of it felt enduring, as though playgrounds would always look that way. They weren't just spaces for exercise. They were places where kids tested their limits, made friends, or escaped into imagination for a short window of the day. So why did so much of that equipment disappear? The answer was less about children losing interest and more about money, risk, and changing rules. Across districts in North America and Europe, playgrounds were gradually stripped down. Swings, tall climbing frames, and seesaws were among the first to go. Where once there had been wooden forts or steel towers, now open squares of asphalt or low plastic modules replaced them. Some schools skipped new installations altogether, leaving little more than a field or a single bench. For today's kids, that emptiness may seem normal, but for those who remember the older structures, the absence feels stark. The forces driving this shift combined over years. Liability concerns grew as accidents, from common broken arms to more serious falls, turned into expensive claims. Insurance companies began treating certain play structures as high risk, driving up premiums for schools. At the same time, districts under budget pressure found that cutting or simplifying equipment kept costs down. New safety standards only increased expenses, sometimes requiring full replacement of older structures rather than simple repairs. In many cases, administrators decided it was financially safer to remove risky equipment than to adapt it. Advocates for play see the cost in other terms. When swings and climbing gear vanish, so do opportunities for risky play, the kind that builds confidence, resilience, and creativity. Instead of racing across the playground, students are now more likely to linger indoors or slip into screen-based routines. Teachers often admit the quieter recess periods make supervision simpler. Yet parents and child development experts worry about what's lost. The independence, social interaction, and movement that open-ended play once guaranteed. This gradual erasure of familiar childhood spaces shows how something seemingly permanent can fade under cultural and economic pressure. And while playgrounds transformed in silence, another part of youth that once looked untouchable, those smiling faces on screens, was quietly building struggles of its own. Child actors can't get jobs. Think about the familiar faces of kids once splashed across movie posters or TV commercials. For a brief window, they seemed to embody success, smiling from red carpets, starring in major franchises, and even showing up as dolls or lunchbox designs. To audiences, it felt like the perfect start to a dream life, the kind of opportunity any child would crave. But for many of those kids, the years after the cameras stopped rolling have been marked more by struggle than stability. Entertainment journalism and first-hand interviews make it clear. Many former child actors report having a hard time moving into adult roles. Casting directors often dismiss them as too recognizable, unwilling to take a chance on someone forever tied to a role from childhood. What once made producers see them as bankable now leaves them typecast and overlooked. The very image that fans adored becomes a barrier to earning new opportunities, trapping them in the shadow of who they once played rather than who they could become. The difficulty doesn't end when they leave Hollywood. Former child stars have described how their resumes, once bolstered by blockbuster credits, frighten off everyday employers. Instead of being seen as hard workers, they're viewed with suspicion, branded as entitled or unlikely to adapt to normal jobs. Attempts to start over quietly often backfire when someone recognizes them, turning every job into a spectacle and opening them up to ridicule online. Entire social media threads thrive on mocking former stars when they take low-paying or ordinary positions, framing basic survival as proof of failure. Education gaps deepen the problem. Many child performers spent their school years with on-set tutors, enough to pass the moment but rarely enough to prepare them for careers outside entertainment. By adulthood, some lack credentials and workforce experience. While their peers were finishing degrees or training for trades, these young actors were memorizing dialogue on sound stages. When the work dried up, they discovered just how few options remain. By 2025, dozens of former child actors have publicly shared similar accounts. Moments of fame followed by years of rejection, unemployment, and rebuilding. The spotlight that looked like it would pave the way forward often narrowed their world instead. Fame doesn't equal a safety net, and the gap between childhood fantasy and adult reality could be stark. And while those struggles show what happens when fame fades, another childhood memory reveals how entertainment and industry shaped lives in an even more hidden way, through what was placed on the table at every meal. Sugar industry's childhood conspiracy. Growing up often meant candy bars in lunchboxes, sodas handed out at parties, and cereal bowls piled high with sugar before school. For many, those foods felt like harmless joys of childhood, small rewards, comfort during tough days, or just part of everyday routine. But the story looks different today because that sweetness wasn't simply background tradition. Historical investigations have shown that the sugar industry played an active role in shaping how children and parents came to view nutrition in the first place. Rather than just promoting candy and soft drinks directly, sugar producers invested in the science that guided public health messaging. Corporate-funded studies often downplayed sugar's connection to obesity, heart disease, and diabetes, redirecting blame toward fats and oils. These narratives didn't stay locked in academic journals. They filtered into government guidelines, nutrition pamphlets, and even the lessons taught in school. The result was a generation raised to treat foods high in sugar as safe components of a supposedly balanced diet. Evidence that emerged by 2024 traced how these efforts influenced the famous food pyramid taught worldwide. Recommendations emphasized bread, pasta, and cereals, many of which contained significant added sugars, while minimizing warnings about excess sweeteners. Parents who believed they were following the best advice unintentionally reinforced habits that matched corporate priorities far more than children's long-term health. Modern data adds weight to those consequences. A pooled meta-analysis in *JAMA Pediatrics identified that approximately 22.2% of children and adolescents worldwide now live with excess weight, including 14.8% overweight and 8.5% obese. WHO reports highlight the same trend, warning about the impact of obesogenic environments where sugary products aren't just available but actively normalized. Within this context, the role of aggressive marketing, favorable research, and targeted lobbying has drawn sharper critique. This doesn't mean every sweet bite was a trap, but it does mean childhood cravings were carefully encouraged by decades of subtle influence. Marketing campaigns and manufactured science blurred the line between indulgence and necessity, teaching millions to see sugar as a harmless staple rather than a long-term risk. Looking back, what seemed like simple pleasures carried persuasive weight. Those memories, once warm and comforting, now unfold as examples of how industries shaped childhood desires in ways most children and parents never recognized at the time. And that same dynamic invites a question not about food, but about feelings. Even the memories of childhood themselves can be weaponized when corporations find ways to sell them back to you. How nostalgia traps you as an adult. You've probably already noticed how pieces of childhood are constantly placed back in front of you as an adult. Old shows return in endless reboots, toy collections from the 80s and 90s reappear on store shelves, and streaming platforms highlight reruns of cartoons once thought gone for good. Retailers carve out entire sections for retro t-shirts, collectible figurines, and remastered video games designed to look, right down to the pixels, exactly like they did the first time you played them. Buying into these items feels harmless, like reclaiming a small piece of the past. But in 2025, nostalgia isn't random, it's engineered as a financial strategy. Recent market research underscores how powerful that strategy has become. McKinsey estimates the U.S. wellness market alone exceeds $500 billion, with younger consumers driving much of this growth. Companies now treat nostalgia as part of that same space, a predictable stream of revenue tied to emotional well-being. They know adults who grew up with familiar brands will pay premium prices to feel the comfort of recognition, often outspending children who engage with the same franchises for the first time. Release schedules for movies, merchandise, and streaming reruns are now built around anniversaries specifically to maximize this effect. The method isn't subtle. Instead of risking new creative directions, corporations recycle imagery that already carries emotional weight. By repackaging the familiar in slightly modernized form, they create the illusion of safety and simplicity, even when sold at high margins. Adults believe they are purchasing joy or escaping stress, when in reality they are being sold back the exact memories they once lived. The comfort feels personal, but the framing is entirely constructed. Psychologists explain why this strategy works. Nostalgia activates reward centers in the brain, creating brief feelings of stability. During times of uncertainty, companies lean harder on this effect, presenting childhood symbols as anchors of reassurance. The consumer isn't buying a toy or shirt so much as the illusion that the past can be re-experienced. Are we buying comfort or being sold it? That's why so many adults find themselves rewatching shows they've memorized or collecting merchandise tied to stories they left behind long ago. Nostalgia functions less like a feeling of connection and more like a system designed to hold attention, loyalty, and spending power. And once you see how these patterns work, it becomes harder to look back on childhood with the same simplicity, because the framework around it begins to reveal itself. Looking back across all these childhood memories, one pattern stands out. Much of what shaped us was influenced by forces we rarely saw. Media and marketing steered how children ate, played, and even imagined their futures. Research now links heavy screen exposure to socio-emotional struggles. Studies connect rising pediatric obesity rates to obesogenic environments, and familiar characters reveal histories shaped as much by corporate goals as by creativity. Nostalgia can feel safe, but it's worth remembering how often it was manufactured. Be mindful of how these forces continue to shape behavior and lean on trusted research when making choices. Which of these facts surprised you most? Leave a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe for more explainers that revisit the stories we thought we knew.